Hello, my name is Gary McCallico. I'm the athletic director at Kennedale High School. And this presentation is going to be an informative session for athletes, parents, and even teachers about our academic eligibility process that we use for athletic eligibility. So this presentation is going to include an explanation of the PIAA and SESD athletic eligibility rules, our process for weekly academic eligibility checks for athletes, our process for preseason academic eligibility, and also the rules associated with attendance. I'm going to start with weekly academic eligibility because I get the most questions about this, especially during the school year. And it also affects the greatest number of students and teachers and parents. So weekly eligibility checks occur starting the third week of the sports season, not the third game week, but the third actual week. So it typically ends up aligning with the start of the games. Versus when we start practices. Our academic eligibility requirement is that a student must be passing all but one of their classes. So they're allowed to have one failure. There are minimum PIAA regulations for academic eligibility. And the minimum regulation is that a student must be passing 50% of their classes. Our academic standards are slightly more rigorous, and you'll see a slight disparity among schools in Pennsylvania. Some schools will have more rigorous standards than what we have, where they have to be passing all of their classes. Some schools, and this is rare, but some schools require athletes to be passing all their classes with a C or better. And there are still a lot of schools that also just enforce the minimum PIAA requirement of passing 50% of their classes. So when a student is ineligible from a weekly grade report, that ineligibility runs from Sunday through Saturday. We actually check grades Thursday afternoon. So we do that because then we have time to communicate ineligibility situations to athletes and coaches. And if an athlete is ineligible for the first time on the weekly grade report, that athlete can practice for the following week, Sunday through Saturday, but they cannot play in a game during that time. If an athlete is ineligible the second time, they won't be able to practice or play during that time, Sunday through Saturday. And if an athlete is ineligible a third time, this is just all during a single sports season, then they would be off the team, regardless of their playing status, if they're a starter, a captain, or whatever, they'll be removed from the team at that time. Now, if an athlete plays, if a student plays another sport, like let's say a student plays football, they were ineligible 3 times during the season, they're off the team and they want to play, he or she wants to play basketball during the winter, their clock in terms of weekly consequences restarts. So there's some nuances to our procedures that involve a lot of moving parts. Teachers and the students and a timeline for when grades are collected can sometimes be a factor on whether or not a student is ineligible. So one thing I think is really important for people to understand is we only pull the report one time. I only pull the report one time. So Thursday afternoons, we pull the report, and then that is the list that we go off of to determine eligibility. I do not have the capability or the time to run real-time grade checks on individual athletes. You know, we have anywhere from 250 athletes during the season to 350 athletes during the season, depending on what season that is. So the time just isn't there to give a lot of one-on-one attention to the academic progress of an athlete. So what we do is we just pull one report during the week, and then we base our eligibility off of that. What we do is we communicate to the coaches and the athletes that if they are ineligible, and I also give coaches a notification on which grade or which subjects the student is failing. Because by doing it on Thursday and Friday morning, it gives the athlete time to have conversations with his or her teacher about a discrepancy that might occur. So a lot of times what we have is a teacher gives an assignment, a teacher collects the assignment, but that assignment hasn't been entered into the grade book yet, which is completely fine. Every teacher is on a different grading timeline, and they always have their grades in within a reasonable amount of time, but it might not be instantaneous. And if we're talking about a literature class or a class that a teacher has to invest several hours into grading materials, they simply might not have had the time to do that yet. So this, by pulling the grade Thursday afternoon and informing the students on Friday versus informing them on Monday, we give the student an opportunity to go back to their teacher and say, this is what's in the grade book, but I know I handed in other assignments that are not reflected in the grade book that would make me have a passing grade. One thing that's really important to understand is that the onus of that conversation falls on the student. Due to time, but also ethical reasons, I do not engage in conversations with teachers on behalf of students. I mean, I do get a lot of stories when I talk to students about their eligibility, reasons, excuses of why they're failing, and sometimes they're legitimate and sometimes they're not. But the reality is that student needs to have the conversation with the teacher as soon as possible to rectify the situation. And then what happens is, and this happens frequently, a teacher will say, oh yeah, I have this paper that I hadn't gotten to enter yet, and with that you will have a passing grade. So that only thing that needs to happen then is that the student needs to have the teacher email me stating that the grade that was pulled in the report is no longer accurate, and the student is now passing. I don't really need to know why. That's not any of my business, to be honest. I just need to know if the student is passing or not. So sometimes what happens is a student thinks that he or she can hand stuff in retroactively and change the grade and therefore change the eligibility. And that really can't happen. I have a lot of students come to me and say, hey, it's Tuesday, I have a game tonight, but I brought my grade up. I'm really happy you brought your grade up, and that's what we're here for, is academics. But it's not going to affect the eligibility unless there's only one caveat to that. And the one thing that would change is if that student had an excused absence. Let's say the student had an excused absence Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the week before, and missed turning in an assignment, but was within that window to have the assignment be handed in late for full credit. If that occurs and the student hands in the paper on, I don't know, on Tuesday before the game, and he or she is still within that window, then the eligibility can retroactively be affected. But if a student just didn't hand in an assignment because they didn't want to do their homework, or they didn't hand it in because they just didn't do it, and they handed in on Tuesday after they were determined to be ineligible, that will not retroactively affect their eligibility. So I think it's important. I mean, it comes down to students doing their due diligence, and then also parents helping out the student, especially if they're younger. I mean, everyone has access to their own grades. And I think it's better to check the grades ahead of time before a problem occurs, so then you can have conversations with the teacher. The most frustrating thing that I encounter is when a student talks to me and they give a lot of excuses about why they might be ineligible. And typically sometimes they're blaming other people, the teacher, whatever, but I'll ask them if they've ever had a conversation with the teacher, and then inevitably they will say no, and they haven't actually talked to the teacher. And I think building a relationship, if you know you're going to struggle in a class, I think building a relationship with your teachers is probably one of the most important things that the student can do, just because a little bit extra effort can go a long way. So that's my advice to athletes or any student, that things are going to struggle, but this is how we will enforce the process of weekly academic eligibility. And we will continue to do the weekly eligibility through the season and even through playoffs. So then we have preseason academic eligibility, which really doesn't have as many moving parts. Preseason academic eligibility is based off of your most previous marking period grade. And it's the same rule. You can't be failing more than one class. Again, the minimum PIAA is you have to be passing 50% of your classes. Ours is a little bit more strenuous, but we will check the most previous marking period grade. If a student failed more than one class, he or she will be ineligible for 15 school days. Sometimes that will jam kids up in the fall season because practice starts before school actually starts. But it's 15 school days, and that's actually written in the PIAA bylaws. So, they can start playing in games, contests after 15 school days, but the athlete can practice during that time. And they can also compete in a scrimmage, because a scrimmage is technically a practice. So, if a student is academically ineligible in the fall, they can still have the benefit of all those practices. They just won't be able to, they'll miss the first probably 4 or 5 games, depending how the season falls. I typically don't check preseason academic eligibility until the week that official practice starts, because I get so many physicals at the very last minute. I use our physical lists to cross-check our failure list. So I do it all at one time, and then so students will get a notification from their coach that they are academically ineligible based off of the most recent marking period grade. However, it should be known, because a student and a parent will know what their previous marking period grades are, and they also will know our policies because they're in the student and athletic handbook, and students and parents always have to indicate that they've reviewed the handbook as part of the physical packet submission. So it shouldn't really be news to anybody. If they're ineligible, they should know the consequences associated with that. Finally, attendance. Students, and this is a rule that we typically don't have to enforce because it doesn't occur very often, especially with athletes. But students can't miss more than 20 days in a previous semester. If they do miss more than 20 days in the previous semester, they have to attend school for 45 days after that 20th day before they can be eligible again. And that 20 school days does count excused and unexcused absences. There are situations outlined in the PIAA handbook. This is a PIAA rule, by the way. There are situations outlined in the PIAA handbook in which a student can get a waiver if they, I remember I had to deal with one that a student was a caretaker for a member of the family in the home, which is why he or she didn't attend school. But really, with how we have adopted our cyber learning platforms, this is going to be more and more rare. And then finally, students must be present in school to participate in after-school activities. So you can't be absent from school and participate in a practice or a game. There are some situations in which, that you can, and that would require a pre-approved situation. Just like in my previous video, we use the college visit. If a student is going on a college visit by himself or with a family during the day or the school day, and then they can be back in time if they are able, they would be able to practice or play in a game. Or we've also had situations where students are on a bereavement, or they've attended a funeral, or maybe a student had a doctor's appointment that was down in Maryland and it involved a lot of time, but it wasn't something that they weren't injured, so they could still come back and participate that night if they were able to make it. But all of those situations need to be approved and communicated in advance. That would come through the coach and I. So that's a quick breakdown of our eligibility procedures and policies. And if you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.